we have this announcement that Maduro's been taken. All of a sudden, people conclude, "Oh, he's gone. Let's flood over there. Let's all go over there," and we could expose people to danger.
But this is the hypocrisy that I see. At the same time that you're issuing these human rights cautions,
Senator Cory Booker raises urgent concerns about U.S. operations in Venezuela, highlighting the lack of congressional oversight, ongoing human rights abuses, and the administration's contradictory policies. He questions how the U.S. can justify stabilizing a government while ignoring the suppression of its citizens and deporting vulnerable people back into harm's way.
We have operations right now that are literally costing the American taxpayer tens of millions of dollars a day. The buildup in the Caribbean alone is hundreds of millions of dollars a month, but we're not providing that kind of oversight that's necessary. So from our power to the purse, to our important work of providing a check and balance to an administration, what we're seeing right now is unacceptable and speaks to what I think is a growing constitutional crisis in our country, which is a Congress that is just lying down for the administration to do whatever it wants, whenever it wants. I want to pick up on my colleague's questioning because I actually know from years of conversations with you, your heart about human rights in countries like Venezuela, Mr. Secretary. And you issued a travel warning, a level 4 travel advisory from your department's website that says, right now in Venezuela, there's a high risk of wrongful detention, torture, terrorism, kidnapping, arbitrary enforcement of laws, crime, and more. And when we hear from the president that he is in charge, that you all are running this government to that extent, I have a lot of concerns when it comes to the rampant human rights violations that are persisting. Cabello is Maduro's key hardline enforcer. He's continued to intimidate and suppress Venezuelan voices. He remains in control of Venezuela's security services, the collectivos. We're seeing extraordinary examples that the constant oppression of the people is continuing as these folks are remaining in control of the country. So I just want to know, what is the plan to address in a much more aggressive manner these severe human rights violations and to try to stop these armed militias? Because if we are doing things to stabilize their government, if we're turning over resources and money to the very groups that are creating these horrors, that seems to me against America's values, and it seems to me something that is should be unacceptable to Congress on both sides.
Yeah, well, absolutely. The Venezuela I described that we want to see emerge from this is one in which none of that is happening. If you think about travel advisories are us imagining worst case scenarios. We have a duty to warn American citizens when they travel to a place that does have a history of Americans being arrested, of Americans being taken. And they may be taken by a deliberate action of a government or entity related to the regime. They may be taken by criminal gangs that control parts of that society. For example, they have these collectivos, as they're called, which basically are these armed motorcycle gangs that are allowed to act with impunity in return for their support for the Maduro regime in the past. You have the ELN and the FARC and other drug trafficking organizations, including Tren de Aragua, that are involved.
Again.
So these are real risks that we have a duty to warn Americans, because here's what we didn't want to see, and don't mean to interrupt you. We have this announcement that Maduro's been taken. All of a sudden, people conclude, "Oh, he's gone. Let's flood over there. Let's all go over there," and we could expose people to danger.
But this is the hypocrisy that I see. At the same time that you're issuing these human rights cautions about what's going on there for Americans, you have a president that's lifting temporary protected status for Venezuelans. Many of them are individuals that have lived in our country for years, if not decades. When I hear from the Venezuelan community, I hear an outrage that at the very same time that you are affirming here that these armed militias are running around suppressing voices, we have an administration that has said very clearly that they're not only going to be lifting temporary protected status for Venezuelans living in the U.S., but instead of protecting longtime American residents, they are, quote, the administration is putting people back on deportation flights and sending them into that madness. Does that make sense to you?
Well, first of all, the travel advisories for American citizens traveling there and the threats posed to Americans. What you're describing
why lift temporary protected status?
Well, the problem with temporary protective status was it was granted to so many people in such a vast numbers so quickly without proper vetting by the previous administration that there's a real concern that there were gang members that had received TPS simply because of the nation they came from and the time in which they came. It became so big and so massive. The overwhelming majority of Venezuelans are not members of Trained at Agua, but there were Trained at Agua and other criminal elements embedded in the TPS system. And the numbers were so large that the administration felt it had to cancel the program in order to appropriately vet it through on the individual cases.
Excuse me, Mr. Secretary, this might not surprise you. I don't trust this administration and the way they use terms like terrorist. I've seen them calling American citizens domestic terrorists, who are people trying to peacefully protest. The problem we have right now is the administration continues to make policies that seem to contradict their words, and yet we don't have a process in place for Congress to do its job because people are not calling folks in for these hearings and not providing the kind of oversight that we need. It is very frustrating to me that we still have a repressive regime in power in Venezuela, suppressing human rights, yet we are cooperating with them. We are funding them, and we're not calling out the ridiculousness of the violence that's going on there. At the same time, we're taking people who have lived in our country for years and years and years and sending them back into that hell where they can be targeted, where they can be abducted, where they can be held for hostage because they know they have American family members that are still here. This is a situation ripe for where we are being complicit in continuing human rights violations, and that needs to stop.
Senator Cory Booker emphasizes the massive financial cost of ongoing U.S. operations in Venezuela, pointing out that these efforts are spending tens of millions of taxpayer dollars every day, with the Caribbean buildup alone costing hundreds of millions per month. He stresses that such enormous expenditures demand serious congressional oversight, yet the lack of transparency has allowed the administration to operate with minimal scrutiny. This absence of checks and balances represents not just a budgetary concern, but a constitutional one, undermining Congress's role and the separation of powers. Without proper oversight, decisions that affect lives, money, and national security proceed unchecked, which Booker warns is dangerous and unacceptable. Booker turns to the human rights situation in Venezuela, highlighting the administration's own travel advisories that warn Americans of extreme risks, including wrongful detention, torture, kidnapping, arbitrary law enforcement, and widespread criminal activity. These warnings, he notes, are contradicted by policies that undermine the safety of people who have lived in the U.S. for years. The decision to lift temporary protected status for Venezuelans, many of whom have built lives in America, puts them back into a country where armed militias and government enforcers continue to suppress dissent and control society through fear. He points out that this approach makes the United States complicit in ongoing oppression, raising serious ethical and moral questions. Booker specifically calls attention to the role of Cababallo and other hardline figures in Maduro's government, along with the collectivos, armed groups acting with impunity. These actors continue to intimidate and silence citizens, and the U.S.'s cooperation with elements of the regime risks enabling the very abuses that it publicly condemns. He challenges the administration's narrative that stabilization efforts justify these risks, emphasizing that policies must align with both American values and humanitarian principles. He also critiques the reasoning for revoking TPS, acknowledging concerns about proper vetting, but emphasizing that the vast majority of Venezuelans covered by the program are not criminals or gang members. Punishing people who have contributed to American society for years because of administrative concerns is unjust. Booker underscores the human consequences of these policies, stressing that deporting individuals into a dangerous environment puts families and communities at risk and erodes trust in government decision-making. Financial oversight, congressional authority, and ethical governance are closely intertwined in Booker's argument. He stresses that without public hearings, reporting, and accountability, the United States risks being complicit in both the mismanagement of taxpayer resources and the perpetuation of human rights abuses. Congressional engagement is critical to ensure that policy decisions reflect legality, morality, and transparency, and that Americans can trust their government to act responsibly abroad. Booker also highlights the contradictions in U.S. policy, warning Americans about dangers in Venezuela while simultaneously lifting protections for long-term residents, sends mixed signals, and undermines America's credibility. He stresses that it is not enough to pursue stabilization or strategic objectives if those actions come at the expense of human life, safety, or fundamental rights. Policy decisions must carefully balance national interests with ethical responsibility, and oversight must ensure that this balance is maintained. He repeatedly calls for transparency and accountability, emphasizing that ethical governance, proper oversight, and adherence to human rights principles cannot be optional in U.S. foreign policy. Mismanagement or lack of scrutiny risks both American credibility and the safety of vulnerable populations. Booker makes clear that decisions about foreign intervention, resource allocation, and national security must uphold American values and protect human life. Oversight and ethical decision-making are essential to prevent the country from enabling or being complicit in oppression while acting abroad.